Hey, good morning. Yesterday, Oklahoma legislature passed the strictest abortion ban in the nation. It says that life begins at fertilization and makes pretty much all abortion illegal. It also relies on citizen enforcement. Once the governor signs this, it will become active immediately. Now, it is clear what the issues are there, but what we're not hearing about is how this could affect Native tribes. In 2020, the Supreme Court ruled that almost half of Oklahoma is actually Native land, meaning law enforcement on tribal lands is done by a tribunal and the federal government, not the state government. But the governor of Oklahoma is not hearing that. He's saying if tribes set up abortion safe havens in the state, they will become a target for local police. So what does that mean then? The federal government would have to send in the National Guard to protect tribal lands? They couldn't. The National Guard is funded federally, but it is controlled by the state governor. So Biden would have to send in the actual army? Well, that's got Civil War vibes written all over it. I'm going to continue following the story, but this is more than just an abortion ban. It greatly affects tribal sovereignty.
So Under the Desk News covered this really important topic, and there are so many layers to go from here, because the reality is, this is part of American history. Like, we need to understand the vigilantism, the violence against marginalized people, the disrespecting of the tribal sovereignty, all of these things layered on top of each other, encapsulated into one moment. Now, the fact that the governor of Oklahoma is saying that he's not going to respect tribal sovereignty is a product of the fact that the federal government doesn't really respect tribal sovereignty either. We say that these reservations are their own sovereign land, and these indigenous nations represent their own sovereign nations, that they should have the authority to govern their own people. And yet at the same time, the federal government basically dictates how their government needs to run, and generally doesn't really respect their sovereignty or territorial integrity at all. Which is exactly why you have institutions like the National Guard that theoretically have jurisdiction over these areas to do different things. It's also why the governor of Oklahoma feels like he can completely ignore any type of local regulations that they have. Because let's be really honest, do you think Joe Biden would bring in the military to defend indigenous folks against the governor of Oklahoma? The answer is, of course not. Joe Biden doesn't have a spine like that. And is the governor of Oklahoma going to be so shameless as to send police into their sovereign territory to enforce laws that are not theirs? Of course he is. These Republicans are shameless and they do not care about the rule of law. They are playing by their own rules at this point. And let's be really real. There's nothing more that Republican governors would love than to throw indigenous people in jail for no reason. And with these incredibly strict anti-abortion laws, which really end up being anti-contraception laws, anti-miscarriage laws, where people could be charged with crimes for things that are far outside of their control, or for making decisions that any human being should have the right to make. This is absolutely draconian, but the fact that it is draconian is exactly the purpose. You see, Republicans want ways to arrest people for no reason. This actually serves a very critical political purpose in the United States of America. You see, with Richard Nixon and the war on drugs, the whole purpose was to create a system where you could very easily charge somebody with a felony and prevent them from voting. That's why police in America have a very long history of planting drugs on people, so they can just throw felony charges on them and boom, easy, stops them from voting. This is so prevalent that 10% of the entire state of Tennessee is denied the right to vote due to a prior felony. And as Republicans grow increasingly unpopular across the country, it's no surprise that they're trying to criminalize abortion across the country so that they can crack down on their political opponents. Now, the Democrats say that they're going to respond to this, but they actually aren't. Structurally and systematically, the Democratic Party is entirely failing to respond to this in any type of substantial way. And this particular case in Oklahoma is very telling and very terrifying, because it basically goes to show that Republicans are committed to resurrecting another wave of violence against indigenous folks. Violence which, mind you, never ended. You see, the state of Minnesota, which has a Democratic governor and has had for some time, has committed extreme acts of violence against indigenous folks who simply didn't want an oil pipeline going through their land. Once again, tribal sovereignty completely ignored. So this is a bipartisan issue, violating the rights of indigenous people. But the fact that Republicans are doing this so brazenly, and the fact that Democrats have already established a long precedent of doing this as well, means that the Republicans are growing increasingly comfortable with violating the rights of every American. Because once again, this is about targeting their political opponents. This is about undermining the rights of half the United States population. This is about their attempts to permanently maintain minority rule, where a select group of rich white men are allowed to dictate policy over everybody else. and anybody who deviates from what they think is appropriate can be easily jailed. These are incredibly terrifying times, and unfortunately it seems like the Democratic Party fundamentally has no interest in responding to them or making them better.
This is Ben Carollo with Rebel Headquarters. You can catch my show Galaxy Brain every Friday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time on the Young Turks Twitch channel, and you can follow me at Benjamin Carollo on Twitter.